Hello and welcome to another edition of PorA. I am your host, David Russell, and I am joined today by both my co-hosts because they're going to actually take over the debate for me and moderate. I'm here with Travis and Caleb. What's up, guys?
What's up?
Well, I can't hear Travis. I guess he just is not going to say anything, but it's okay.
Hey, what's going on, David?
Hey,
Caleb,
what's up, buddy?
Eric,
How you guys
and Ben.
been? Good?
Oh, yeah, been really good. Really
Awesome.
looking forward to tonight's conversation. This is a subject
yeah.
I happen to be really interested in, and I'm starting to look into, and so I can't wait for tonight.
Right on. Caleb, how's the book writing going?
It's going. Keeps getting longer, so hopefully it'll be out preferably summer, but we'll see. So I'm excited for it, though.
Right
Doing
on.
between this and podcasting, going on other people's shows and interviews and having a job, it's just, and a social life, it's just a lot. So, trying
I could imagine.
balance all that, but it's still fun. So I'm excited for our debate. It's nice that we have two Texans on the stage, on the stage for once.
Yeah.
So
and you know what's even better is our third Texan is going to be a moderator tonight, and I'm just going to give me a break. So, but so guys, I'm going to kick it over to you two and let you guys introduce our guests because they are honorable guests and they have quite a big following on their YouTubes as well and their channels and their various ministries. So I'm going to kick it over to you guys and let you introduce these special, awesome guests. And I'm going to get out of here and monitor the tech side of everything.
Yeah. So,
go ahead, Travis. You can introduce Eric.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Okay, so Eric Hernandez is the lead apologist of Texas Baptist, and this is really interesting for myself because my home church happens to be, involved with Texas Baptist. In fact, Eric and I are due for coffee to hang out sometime really soon because we're both from Dallas. So, Eric does a lot of work on the soul and things of that nature, and so. Really looking forward to this conversation. So, Eric, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us, about your channel, about Texas Baptist, what it is you do, things of that nature.
Thanks for having me, and it's an honor and pleasure to be having this discussion with Ben. I want to say that as well, and thank you guys for having both of us. You pretty much summed it up. I'm the apologetics lead for Texas Baptist. That encompasses everything from hosting and organizing 3 annual unapologetic evangelism conferences and going to churches myself, doing some trainings with some of the staff or youth or anything like that, and having awesome discussions like this. So it's good to be on. Thank you.
Yeah, great to have you, Eric.
And in the other corner, we have Ben Watkins, who is certainly no stranger to our show. Although I don't know, I've heard people tell me that Ben Watkins is a closeted theist, but I believe he's representing the atheist side today. So Ben, are you a closeted theist, and which position will you be taking today?
I will be taking the atheist side, but I will let listeners decide whether or not they think I'm a theist plant or not.
Okay, that'll be sure. I hope this is a very spirited conversation. You see what I did there? Because it's very soulful. And with that, I believe, Travis, are we having Eric go first since he's the affirmative?
Yeah, I believe that's what we decided on.
So Eric will go first, and then Ben will talk, and I think we're just going to have cross-examination for there. So with that, Eric, go ahead.
All right.
Thanks. I haven't timed this. I'm not gonna lie. I played with my son a lot this week, and I didn't get.
We're not going to be very strict on your time, so you'll be good.
So okay, and by all means, just let me know. I guess when I have like a couple minutes left. So
all right, roughly like 10 to 15 minutes, something like that.
Okay, sounds good. That should be perfect. All right, let me share a screen here. I'm not going to read that. Yeah. Okay. And it doesn't give me that option, so I'm just going to share my host screen. Okay. All right, can you see my slides?
I believe they're coming up. There they go.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to argue 2 basic points for the existence of the soul. The first is consciousness is not physical. That is to say, neither identical nor reducible to something physical. And that I am more than a brain and body. I am a soul. Now, to spend some time first just with some definitions, I would define the soul as an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness along with its states and properties and animates the body. Now, the soul, I would say, is a self. It is a conscious subject. It is I. in order to go at these two basic points, we'll need to first brushing up on what's known as a law of identity, or the longer phrase is Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. Now, according to Leibniz's law, if two things in question are the same, say some A and B, then whatever is true of one is going to be true of the other and vice versa. But if in principle we can find something true of one that's not true of the other, again, or vice versa, then it follows they're not the same thing. Now, I won't spend too much time on this because based on our discussion, Ben and I seem to agree that the mind and brain are not identical or reducible to each other. And so that would mean that the mind would be something immaterial. But just to throw out there, there's lots of examples, because if we look at something like physicalism, and it depends on which type of physicalism one holds to, a strict physicalism would say that human beings are purely physical objects. Now, with regards to consciousness, it would mean that whatever is true of one is going to be true of the other. But again, if we can find something true of one, not the other, then not the same thing. And that would mean that physicalism, at least a strict physicalism, would be false. And you would have to punt to something or hold to something like dualism, be it property dualism or substance dualism. And I'll let Ben talk more about those. But some common examples I like to give is a state of my mind, which is a thought or belief. My mental states can have the property of being true or false, but my neurons firing, which is a state of my brain, are not true or false. My brain can be 3 pounds, but my thought that I'm talking to Ben is not 3 pounds. My brain can be in a state that's 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana is not 7 inches long. And just based on those alone, given Leibniz's law of identity, we can show that they're not the same thing. They're not identical or reducible to the other. Now, the other thing I want to bring out is the fact that causal dependence is not the same thing as identity. In fact, I would go as far as to say, as Moreland has said, that any views when it comes to consciousness is going to be empirically equivalent. That is to say, there is no scientific data that's going to lend support to one over the other, because at the end of the day, our conclusions and arguments are going to be philosophical in nature, not scientific. So I've often alluded to things like playing a guitar or piano, that just because I have a cause or dependence relationship on playing music with specific parts of an instrument like a guitar or piano, it doesn't follow they're the same thing, nor does it follow that the note C or the music is inside the guitar or piano. You don't open a piano and reach in and find the note C. So in the same way, when we look at these types of dependencies of something like playing a guitar, the note C, playing music rather, being dependent or caused by the guitar and its strings, it doesn't follow they're the same thing. And similarly, just because you can show that affecting certain states of my brain with brain damage or Alzheimer's, you can certainly show that it affects my conscious states. But as I've just explained, it wouldn't follow that they're the same thing, because, again, to reiterate, cause or dependence is not the same thing as identity. Now, when it comes to the first point, we look at also something called the irreducibility of consciousness. And just I just left these in my slides, but I think they're so relevant to Ben's position. I know Nagel argues from his book something that, like, you cannot get mind from matter. You can't just rearrange a complicated structure of matter and expect mind to pop into existence. And Colin McGinn says something like, any natural explanation for consciousness borders on sheer magic. Jaegwon Kim has famously argued that correlations are not explanations, but are in fact the very thing that need explaining. Now, what's meant by this is that Ben and I are both going to agree that affecting, as I said earlier, affecting certain parts of my brain are going to affect my mental states or functions. But there's going to need to be an explanation for why these things happen. And even more so, something called the hard problem of consciousness. Saying that there's a correlation between mind and brain is just calling it something like emergent or supervenient is just slapping a label on the problem. It's not actually solving the problem. In fact, this very correlation, that if it is a case that the mind somehow supervenes on brain states, that correlation is not sufficient to explain it, but is in fact the very thing that needs explaining. So you can't just slap the label of some type of a necessary correlation on it. On the second point, I am more than my brain and body. I am a soul. Now, the reason I say this is because if consciousness exists, and if Ben and I would both agree that it's something immaterial, then it's going to need to be possessed by something. And now I know without a doubt that I possess consciousness, but now the question becomes, what am I? So there needs to be some type of conscious subject possessing these mental properties. And we may get into it, into going into whether or not something like brain states can possess these mental properties. But my position would be substance dualism, that I am an immaterial substance that possesses these things. So, of course, now the question becomes, what am I? Again, using the law of identity, if I'm a brain and body, and this would apply to other things, because basically a brain and body would be a mereological aggregate, which is a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Now, this would apply also in some sense to things like memories. And again, I'll let Ben talk about that when he expresses his position. But even a collection of certain mental states or memories or thoughts or beliefs would still be some type of different aspects of a thing that would need to be together in some sort of structure if it's going to be related to the physical. And when we look at three arguments that I'll go over, maybe four if we have time. My first is the indivisibility of personhood. I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. And again, aggregates would be things like cars, watches, or Lego bricks. They're separable parts held together in a certain structure. Purely physical objects can be divided in common percentages or degrees. So if I were to cut a table in half, it would make sense to say that I have 50% of a table. And if I am a purely physical object, then cutting me in half would mean that I am 50% of a person. But it would make no sense, I would say, we can intuit that if you cut off my arms and legs, say, I'm not 50% of a person, though I have 50% of a body. So essentially, I cannot be divided or come in percentages or degrees because I'm an all or nothing kind of thing. I'm what philosophers would call a non-degreed property. So something like the property of being even is a non-degreed property. The number 2 and the number 6 are both even numbers, but it makes no sense to say that the number 6 is more even than the number 2. You can run the same argument when it comes to the brain. Some people are born with not a full brain. They're born with 80% of a brain, or there can be operations where they take parts of the brain out. But if you have 75% of a brain, you're not 75% of a person. You may lose functioning, but functioning is not what gives us the identity as persons. So if I'm not divided, if I can't be divided or come in percentage of degrees, then I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. Now, for the second one is identity through change. Using the same first premise, if I'm a purely physical object, then I do not retain identity through change or part replacement. I do maintain identity through change and part replacement. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. Now, this is going to get into identity through change. However, Ben wants to hash out identity. I would argue that you cannot ground it in something physical or something material like the brain or body, because these things are constantly replacing our parts. Jaegwon Kim once noted that, for example, it's known that every 7 to 10 years, we replace virtually every cell in our body. And Jaegwon Kim gives an argument, who's an atheist philosopher, says something like, this brain and body did not exist in 2001, but I did exist in 2001. And you can conclude from that therefore I am not identical nor reducible to a brain and body. I would say the same would apply to a memory view. Now, when we go into free will, again, first premise the same, and I'm going to rush through these because I think we'll unpack a lot more in our discussion time. If I'm a purely physical object, then I do not possess free will. Now, I believe Ben's a compatibilist, so he may reject this third premise that we do possess libertarian free will. By libertarian free will, I simply mean that I am the ultimate originator of my will or actions. Nothing causes me to act. I freely will to as a first mover. Now, I would also go on to say if someone rejects libertarian free will, then I'd say you're going to have to reject something like moral responsibility or intellectual integrity. In other words, if we want to be held more responsible or want to hold others more responsible for their actions, we're going to have to assume that they were the first cause in whatever chain of events they acted in, say, to bring about some type of a murder with something like a gun or bullet. Same thing with intellectual integrity. There has to be some sense of libertarian free will to be able to choose to freely follow the evidence and to be able to assess your conclusions without being determined to believe one way or the other about the conclusions you come to. So if I do possess libertarian free will, then I'm not a purely physical object. I am a soul. The argument that I did not get to make slides for that I'll just briefly touch on, and let me stop sharing there, is an argument that Willem Hasker and Eric LaRocque advance. I'm more familiar with Eric LaRocque's argument, but basically he says something like the following. He says Well, not him saying, but he's relating the fact that based on modern neuroscience, we know that when you look at an object, there are certain regions of the brain that are correlated with identifying different aspects of the object. So if I look at something like a remote, certain parts of my brain are associated with the color, the size, the shape, and so forth. But there is no part of the brain that brings these all together into a unified visual field. This is known as the argument from either the unity of consciousness or more particularly the unified visual field. So the example he gives, and I modify his example, is suppose you have 10 chefs in 10 separate kitchens working on individually a part of a recipe for a cake. Now, just because these 10 chefs are at the same time synchronized working on this part of a recipe, there's no one chef that's making an entire cake. For that, you would need some type of master chef to bring these ingredients and parts together to make one whole cake. So the argument essentially is that if there's no part of my brain that brings these things together, then I shouldn't have a unified visual field. But I do have a unified visual field. Therefore, I'm not identical or reducible to some physical aggregate. I am something like a soul. So based on those two, and again, we'll get into deeper discussion. Basically, if consciousness is not physical, then then it would need to be possessed by something. Well, no, excuse me. If consciousness is not physical, then we have now some type of duality, at the very least, a property dualism. And if I possess consciousness, and you would have to ask, what am I? And then I would argue that it has to be possessed by some immaterial substance because nothing physical can possess these things. And then given that I'm not more than my brain and body, we have more reasons to conclude that I am not something physical. I am something immaterial, like a soul. I don't know how much time that was.
Yeah, no, you're good. Thank you for that, Eric. All right. Ben, are you ready for your opening statement?
Yes, let me go ahead and share my screen.
Okay.
Great.
All right, y'all can see it just fine? Guys?
Yes, sir.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
All right.
sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. So first off, let me thank Eric for agreeing to have this discussion. I'm really excited about this. I actually think we have some deep disagreements, but however, we also have some surprising common ground. And so I'm really excited to see how the conversation plays out. So I take the central question we are discussing to be whether or not there are any souls, where I will understand a soul as a purely immaterial substance that our minds are the properties of and can survive the material deaths of our bodies. My position will be a negative one, and drawing from sources in the philosophy of mind, neuroscience, and the philosophy of science. I will argue that purely immaterial minds are improbable given certain observations and background knowledge. I will call this reasoning the argument from physical minds. I have a good deal of ground to cover, so let's get started. Before getting to my argument from physical minds, I want to lay out a little background context in which our question is being asked. One of the most notorious puzzles in philosophy is what is known as the mind-body problem. The problem is essentially how does what we call mind fit into the world? The mind-body problem can be understood with a simple inconsistent tetrad. An inconsistent tetrad is a set of 4 propositions of which only 3 can be true. Given any 3 of the propositions, we can deduce the falsity of the 4th. For example, if we suppose that A, B, and C listed on the screen, then we can deduce the falsity of D. Similarly, if we accept B, C, and D, then we can deduce that A is false. In fact, that's exactly what I plan to do here. So the first claim is that our minds are properties of non-physical substances or souls. This is obviously the claim that I will be denying. But I think we have some interesting common ground here. So I've highlighted B and C because I think this is our common ground. I will here suppose without argument that B and C are not only true, but are also mine and Eric's common ground. I will suppose neither Eric nor I are idealists in the sense that we deny that our bodies and complex brains consist of physical substance or matter. Additionally, I will suppose neither Eric nor I deny that minds and bodies causally interact. So neither of us are epiphenomenalists who claim minds don't interact with bodies, nor are we parallelists who believe minds and bodies only act in parallel with each other without actually causally influencing one another. So that leaves us with two major traditions we find in contemporary philosophy of mind: the dualist tradition and the monist tradition. So let's start with the dualist tradition. I will suppose from here on out that this is Eric's position on the mind-body problem. According to substance dualism, our minds are properties of non-physical substances, or souls. So premise D of the inconsistent tetrad is false. Given this view, immaterial minds and material bodies are two ontologically distinct substances. But the dualist tradition is not limited to substance dualism. There's another dualist view, often called property dualism. This form of dualism does not deny there is only a single substance in the world, but rather insists there are two distinct properties. On this view, something like consciousness is fundamental and might even be universal. What is often called materialism or physicalism obviously denies A. Our minds are properties of non-physical substances, or souls. You might think the monist tradition is limited to denying A, but that is not so. There is another monist tradition that takes a very different route. Idealism is a monist view that denies B rather than A. When I claim that I'm a materialist or a physicalist, I mean I'm not an idealist in this monist tradition. I take the physical world for granted. I do not deny our bodies are properties of physical substances. I also mean minds imply matter, but I do not claim that matter implies mind. I do not mean mind and matter are identical nor reducible to one another. So where do I start trying to answer the mind-body problem? Well, first off, I think it should be noted that this is a surprising area where Eric and I have a common ground. The first claim he gave tonight was that mind and brain are not identical. We are both anti-reductionists in this sense. But since I'm not a substance dualist, what are the other options on the table for me? I find myself firmly in the anti-reductionist camp. I'm neither an identity theorist nor an eliminativist about the mind-body problem, though my case will ultimately be compatible with those views. What I'm looking for in a philosophy of mind is a view that makes the most sense of these three rational intuitions listed on the screen. The first is that minds are real and irreducible features of the world. We cannot know what it's like to be a bat, so there is a hard problem of consciousness. I concede that. The second is that our minds causally interact with brains. So there is some sort of solution to the interaction problem. My mind can influence my brain, and my brain can influence my mind. The third claim is that our minds are features of particular brains. So there's a solution to what's known as the pairing problem. Why does my mind attach itself to this particular brain? Why can't my mind inhabit some other brain? There must be some solution to this problem. So to use the cheesy Hegelian jargon, I want a view that sublates or synthesizes these features into a single holistic model that is true not only to the findings in neuroscience, but also is true to our experiences of having minds. So here are some anti-reductionist options. I think there are at least three on the table for me. The first is neutral monism, which insists there is a single irreducible substance, but must be described using both physical and mental concepts. I've already mentioned property dualism, the view that denies there are two unique substances, but insists there are two unique properties in the universe. And I've also already mentioned epiphenomenalism, the view that minds are a non-physical substance, but denies that minds and brains causally interact. I've already ruled out epiphenomenalism as our common ground, and property dualism insists on a distinction between mental and physical properties. We can understand how physical properties causally interact with mental properties, just like in epiphenomenalism, but it's unclear how mental properties interact with physical properties. It's not clear property dualism is really a distinct view from epiphenomenalism. I'll rule them both out and settle for a neutral monist view here. So, is this enough for an argument against immaterial souls? Such an argument might look like this. Neutral monism implies there are no purely non-physical minds like souls. Premise F, neutral monism is true, therefore there are no non-physical minds like souls. But premise F of this argument begs the question against the dualist tradition Eric is defending. This is not a good argument because it does not appeal to premises all disagreeing parties can readily concede without further argument. Rather than arguing against souls by arguing for neutral monism, I'll instead argue against souls by arguing against immaterial minds directly. So instead of defending neutral monism, I will instead defend at least 3 claims that each entail there are no purely immaterial minds. These 3 claims will also be compatible with my approach to the mind-body problem that we've seen is neutral monism. We've now arrived at the reasoning I've called the argument from physical minds. I'm claiming there are no non-physical minds like souls because it's improbable that 1, all mental changes have sufficient material causes, i.e. every mind must be caused by something physical. The second claim is that all mental differences imply material differences, i.e. nothing mental happens without something physical happening. And the third claim is that all mental properties supervene on physical properties, i.e. minds imply matter, but matter does not imply minds. It's important to realize what my argument is not doing. The argument from physical minds does not claim there are no non-physical minds because minds are identical to physical matter. Remember, I'm not a reductive physicalist nor an eliminativist. Perhaps that claim is true, but the argument from physical minds does not have to make it, and I ruled it out in my earlier reasoning about the mind-body problem. The argument from physical minds instead appeals to the more modest claim that minds causally depend on complex physical structures, like the neurons of an organic brain or the silicon of a supercomputer. So, but why think that any of the previous claims are true? I want to give at least 6 uncontroversial facts from at least 5 uncontroversial facts from neuroscience about the relationships between minds and brains in any known species that support my central thesis. The first is that given any known species of vertebra, directly stimulating a physical brain causes that brain to have corresponding mental experiences. Some physical injuries to the brain make it impossible to have mental experiences at all. The third line of evidence is which mental capacities are destroyed by injury are correlated to the particular physical regions damaged. For example, dementia is an injury to the memory regions of brains. The fourth line of evidence is that development of mental capacities, including higher order capacities like personality, are correlated with increased neuronal complexity in embodied brains. The fifth line of evidence is that minds and their psychological traits are physically related by genetics. I think this is the most interesting finding in that we can actually predict mental properties of future offspring by observing genetics. So, how does my 5 lines of evidence support the 3 central claims I've made? I'll now have to turn to the philosophy of science. I hope it's obvious the first claim is much too strong here. To say that my 5 lines of evidence entail or prove there are non-physical minds is not going to be the route to go. I'm not inferring my 3 claims from these 5 lines of evidence such that they prove them like in a deductive argument. So I'm not claiming E1 through 5 entail my 3 claims. I readily concede these facts are logically compatible with my 3 claims being false. E1 through 5 instead support my 3 claims inductively, that is to say, probabilistically. A familiar sort of inductive explanation for a set of facts is often called an inference to the best explanation. Perhaps an inference to the best explanation is an inference to the most probable hypothesis, given some set of facts. It is in this sense that I am inferring my 3 claims from my 5 lines of evidence. So we finally arrived at my argument from physical minds. Premise H claims that necessarily immaterial substances like souls imply purely immaterial minds. Premise I says it is probable there are no purely immaterial minds, and this claim is supported inductively or probabilistically by my 5 lines of evidence I previously mentioned. Therefore, Conclusion J follows. It is probable there are no immaterial substances like souls. Premise H is an analytic truth. That is to say, it's true by definition. What we mean when we talk of souls are disembodied minds that do not depend on anything physical or otherwise material and might survive our death. Premise I is inductively inferred, again, from the 5 lines of evidence that I gave before. And premise H and I entail conclusion J. So I know I've put a lot on the table so far, and I readily concede that the mind-body problem is a really thorny problem in the philosophy of mind. It's one of those questions that keeps me up at night. So having put the mind-body problem on the table and the argument from physical minds, I think now's the perfect time to open up for open discussion.
Thank you both very much. So yeah, I think you all both made interesting discussions, and I'm excited to see it. So the way I have it is I've written down a lot of questions for both of you. So I'm just going to start off with a question, and both of you all can just use that as a launching pad to go into a free discussion and kind of see where it goes. And if we need more moderation to get back on particular topics, that's good. So I think a good area to start would be, so we hear from both sides on Ben's retort a lot about this idea of the interaction problem, the mind-body problem. So I guess starting with Eric, and then Ben can comment, they can discuss this if they want. How exactly would you deal with this as far as the question, how do souls interact with the body if they're not material?
Yeah, so it's a good question. First thing I'd say that if he concedes that the mind is immaterial, like I said, it's neither reducible nor identical to something physical like the brain, then I would say that we both have this problem. So his view wouldn't solve it. And I know in other discussions he's called it necessary, but I'm going to push back and say slapping the label necessary on it doesn't solve it, and you're still just showing a correlation, and we can get into the nature of how this could be necessary in the first place. Second thing I'd say is that the question of interaction, I don't think is something that an answer to that question isn't going to make the existence of the soul stand or fall. The reason being is because this is more of an epistemic question, not an ontological question of whether or not there is a soul. Another thing I could say is that I would argue that it is just a basic primitive action. To ask how it interacts, by that one could mean what's the intervening mechanism. But if you say A interacts with B by some intervening mechanism C, then you're going to have to then push back the goalposts and say, well, how does A interact with C in order to interact with B? And I would say you lead into an infinite regress. So I would say it's best explained by a basic primitive action. Other times people push back and say that this would somehow it would break the law of basically conservation of energy. And a few things to that, especially going into causal closure, which is another reason I would say that a physicalist view would have to reject free will, is something like causal closure or the conservation of energy principle. These are kind of rule of thumb principles for closed systems. So you would have to beg the question, or at least provide a reason why this would be a closed system. And it would apply to things that are purely physical. So if Ben's going to concede the mind's immaterial, you no longer have a purely physical set of factors that you're dealing with. And that's why I say he too would have to give an answer to some interaction problem. I know there's other responses have been that even if the soul does produce some kind of energy, it may be trivial in comparison to the energy that's already in the body. So I've heard Moreland give an example of, like, say you could flip a switch that would release all the water in the Hoover Dam. The amount of energy it takes to flip the switch is again trivial compared to the amount of energy that'll be released from the water coming out of the dam. So it could be virtually, if not impossible, to detect what the energy comes from. Another interesting answer to this has been alluding to something like quantum entanglement, where you have two, I believe they're particles. This is beyond my pay grade, if you will, where if you observe one, it causes something to happen in the other, and they're so far apart that there's no exchange of energy going on. So it could be that the soul's interaction with the body or brain is something similar to that, where there needs not be an exchange of energy. Regardless, I think any of these answers would suffice to show that it doesn't prove or disprove substance dualism. At best, it's an epistemic question that we'd roll up our sleeves and look at, but it wouldn't show whether or not the soul exists. And let me say one last thing. I think Ben is at least a property dualist if he's going to concede the mind's immaterial, and this would lead to some type of epiphenomenalism. So if he's going to hold to the mind being something immaterial that's caused or dependent on something physical, which is, it seemed like what he argued, then you're not going to be able to have some type of top-down causation. You're going to have to go to something like epiphenomenalism, and this is what Jaegwon Kim argues, that any type of property dualism isn't going to have this top-down causation, so you won't have mental states causing anything. So my mental state of being thirsty won't cause me to get a drink because it just kind of rides on top of these physical structures.
All right, Ben, you have a whole buffet there to pick from. Anything you'd like to discuss on that?
Yeah. So let me go ahead and start with the interaction problem and the conservation of energy. So those who are not familiar with my background, I am by day a nuclear engineer. And so one of the things that I find very interesting about this question is how the laws of thermodynamics are applied to the mind-body problem. So Eric mentioned it earlier, the conservation of energy, but there's another thesis that someone like me would want to appeal to, which is called the causal closure of the physical. And so this is the idea that prima facie non-physical or otherwise immaterial events that causally interact with the physical world must be at least physically dependent so that there can be a transfer of energy. Now, why does there have to be this transfer of energy? Because of the conservation of energy. So what is the conservation of energy? The conservation of energy is one of those most basic fundamental laws of nature that we're aware of. It's the idea that energy can be neither created nor destroyed. Rather, it can only change from one form to another. So to give a helpful way of understanding this, the net total energy of an isolated system always remains constant over time. And so the energy from physical brains cannot causally interact with purely non-physical minds to reduce the net total of its own energy and vice versa. So according to the interaction problem, physical and non-physical things cannot causally interact without deviating from this basic law of nature. And I think this is a similar claim that would apply to things like abstract objects that have neither mass, energy, nor spatial extension. And that's why we think the number 6 doesn't causally interact with anything, is because it's abstract. It's not something within the physical world. So how does my neutral monist view try to solve this interaction problem? I mentioned earlier that there must be some solution to this interaction problem because we want to take it as a given, the common ground that Eric and I have, that our minds and our brains do causally interact. And the way that I do that is by admitting that there's only one substance in the world, and this substance obeys that conservation of energy. The net total energy is always going to remain constant in an isolated system, and that our brains are isolated systems. So if this is not begging the question against something from the outside coming in and changing the net total energy of our brains. The thing is, the net total energy of our brains, when we observe them through time, the energy remains constant. So that's an observation that I think counts against the substance dualist view. The neutral monist view says, look, there's this one neutral substance obeys this one fundamental law of thermodynamics at all places and all times. However, we cannot fully describe it without using mental and physical concepts. So we're going to have at least 2 different language games that cannot be reduced from one to the other. So the helpful analogy that I like to give is of a coin. So a coin has 2 sides. There's only one coin. I can't characterize the coin in its entirety without describing both the front face of the coin and the other side of the coin. But there's also a phenomenology that comes with this coin. If I'm looking at one side of the coin, I can't see the other side of the coin. I have to flip it around. But if I flip it around to see that side of the coin, the side that I was just looking at, I can no longer see. And I think something similar is happening when we describe this neutral substance in mental and physical terms. If we describe it in nothing but physical terms, we're going to leave out the first person subjective characteristics. But if we focus on the first person subjective characteristics of something like consciousness, the raw experience, we're not talking about it in those physical terms that we were using earlier. And so I think this is a really important point of just the nature of what we find ourselves in human experience, that we cannot reduce either of these language games to one or the other, but we also can't fully describe reality without appealing to both of these language games. So that's how I would solve the interaction problem. So in my view, something like consciousness and even minds in general are similar to photosynthesis or mitosis or digestion. They're higher order biological functions that are complex, but what's unique about them, what separates them from something like photosynthesis, is that it has this irreducible subjective first person quality. And that's the ingredient that we have to add in order to distinguish it from something like digestion or mitosis. And that's what makes it particularly this interesting thing to study. So I know I've said a lot there. I'm sure Eric wants to respond to a little bit. So before I want to come back to the pairing problem, because there's not only this interaction problem, but there's a related problem known as the pairing problem. So I'll let Eric take the floor now to respond to that and then come back to the pairing problem.
Yeah, and if Eric can do that, and then I have questions for both of you as well after that. But Eric, go ahead and respond to anything you want from what Ben said.
Yeah, if it's okay with you, I'd like to kind of have a little back and forth on this one.
Absolutely.
To get some clarification, because I think, and I don't think this is intentionally or even disingenuous on Ben's part, but I know in our conversation we had over the phone before this, I brought up some points that I think would be good to clarify, because he talks about that there wouldn't be any purely non-physical minds, but it would depend on what he means by purely non-physical, because if he concedes that the mind is not physical, then it seems like what he means by purely non-physical is simply that something independent of something physical. But if something physical causes or something mental, which is non-physical, supervenes on brain states, then it's still non-physical, and adding the word purely doesn't really say much other than to imply that it's caused or dependent on something physical, but the mind itself would still not be physical, even if it's caused or dependent on something physical. His illustration or analogy talks about a coin, and I know all analogies are going to break down at some point, but the problem specifically there is that both sides of the coin can be described purely in physical terms. So it's still going to be, you're still describing physical aspects of something physical. When it comes to the mind, you notice he says, I know he calls it a language game, but I think it's something more than that. It shows that something, for example, I would say that something is physical if it can be described in the language of chemistry and physics. If it's not physical. If it can't be, it's not physical. So this would show that the mind's something immaterial. And he talked about there being a substance that obeys these things. But again, even if I were to grant that the substance is what's obeying these things, that says nothing about the mind. Because if the mind is supervening on top of the physical, then sure, you could have still the physical sub-base entities obeying these physical laws, but that says nothing about whether or not the mental will, because now you're going to be applying something physical to something immaterial. So I don't think that works. But there's more to say, but I'll say there, and we can just go back and forth if you want to on that.
Yeah, for sure. So let me start with the meaning. I think there was a question of meaning about what I mean by a purely physical mind. So when I say a purely physical mind, I mean mental activity that does not imply something physical. So think of it like a side of a coin that didn't imply the other side of the coin. And so that would seem kind of weird. And so I think that's the right intuition here that we can glean from the analogy. Eric is absolutely right to point out that analogies break down. And so my analogy with a coin it's something purely physical. I also used analogies with digestion and mitosis and photosynthesis. And I realized those analogies break down at certain too, because there was something else. There was another part of the language game that we needed to add, the irreducible, subjective first-person quality of something like a mind and consciousness. So I get that. What I'm trying to say is that we can't have a purely non-physical mind, just like we can't have a pure one side of a coin. That's the mistake. That's where we're going to think that it's broken down, that we can have this one language game that we're calling the mental language game can just subsist and it just exist on its own. Now, I think. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, can I see if I understand your view? It sounds like you're saying that we cannot have mind without matter. Is that right?
Yes. So that
Right.
was one of the three claims
Yes.
that I was saying. So that when I gave the 5 lines of evidence, I'm trying to explain those using hypotheses. One of the hypotheses is that all mental properties supervene on physical properties. So what does that mean? I know that's jargon, and I probably should have explained that better in my opening. So let me take an opportunity to clarify that meaning here. So I mean that minds imply matter, but matter does not imply mind. We cannot have a change in mental properties without a change in physical properties. If you were to take a person and there was no change in their physical properties in their brains, they would have no mental change. However, I also think that minds are late and local on the scene. Something like consciousness might be fundamental and it might be universal. However, the complexity of a mind, something with thoughts, personality, memories, these are complex biological functions like digestion, mitosis, photosynthesis that have had to evolve over time. And so the complexity of and the richness of our mental lives, of our minds, comes from how evolution has selected for that. And so that you don't just have mind, you might have mental properties that are fundamental and universal, but minds as complex thinking things aren't fundamental.
It seems so. I'm curious as to how you. I guess a 2-part question.
Sure.
How would you justify that you cannot have mind without matter? Because as a side note, that would automatically rule out theism, which is quite a bold claim, as I'm sure you would concede that. And how do we even observe mind in the first place? How would you observe the mind?
Well, so that's the tricky part. So let me start with the second of those questions. Observing mind, the very nature of mind, the very thing that we're trying to observe by its nature, by its character, is subjective. It's irreducibly subjective. I cannot know what it's like to be a bat. So you appealed to Thomas Nagel earlier in Mind and Cosmos. So my view is exactly the same as Thomas Nagel's in Mind and Cosmos. And one of his famous papers is that the form of life that a bat lives using echolocation is so far removed from our first-person subjective experience that the best we could do is to imagine ourselves, our subjective inner first-person quality experiences using something like echolocation. We could know all of the physical facts about a bat, but we still would not know what it is like to use echolocation. So to say, how do you observe mind? The only answer I can give you is introspection, to turn in towards your own subjective first-person intersubjective experience, the taste of a strawberry, the feeling of an orgasm, the tactile feeling, the tactile sensation of sand. These, what is often called, to use the jargon, the qualia of experience, what its likeness. And I readily admit that if we're using visual perception, something that we would use the mental language game in order to describe, we're going to leave something out. And that's the unique feature of this. Now, to say I'm ruling out theism, this is where the philosophy of science is going to come in. I'm not ruling out theism in some deductive sense or in some way that my model entails that there aren't this. I'm using those 5 lines of evidence to probabilistically support those 3 theses that I put on the screen. And those 3 theses, I think, are what entail that something like theism would be false. But that's not to rule them out in some deductive or entailment
Sure.
sense.
And maybe I misstated that. In other words, if your view is true that you cannot have mind without matter, then that would automatically rule out that God can exist as an unembodied mind.
Well, so that's why, this is an argument. The argument from physical minds not only is an argument against non-physical minds like ghosts and souls or demons, but yes, it would also be an argument against an unembodied mind like a perfect being. So yes, I think that this argument can extend to God. However, there are some quirks with that. So there are some famous theists, someone like Peter Van Inwagen, who is a physicalist, who is a reductive physicalist. He believes that mind and bodies are identical. And so I can't make much sense of that view. But however, he would insist that my argument succeeds against something like souls, but doesn't succeed against something like God. God would just be the exception to this. I think that move is ad hoc, but I'd be remiss as a philosopher to not even mention that, because it's not just Peter Van Inwagen. I believe, I'm trying to think of his name. It's escaping me. He's at Rutgers University. Dean Zimmerman is of the same sort of persuasion. So this view is found out there in the wild. And so I would want to at least mention it for the listeners.
Yeah, and wouldn't it be the case that this first person private access would actually kind of weaken that point that you cannot have mental change without physical change? Because when we were both young, 4 or 5 years old, we could identify our mental changes, but we had no idea of any physical changes in the brain. And this would have to be something that would be a posteriori thing that you discover. But I don't see how you go from that to say, well, then universally there can't be any physical change without mental change, especially if you can see that you cannot observe mind other than in yourself.
Well, so I think these are the discoveries of neuroscience. So you're right. When we were kids, hundreds of years ago, before neuroscience looked anything like...
I was not a kid 100 years ago, by the way.
Fair enough. When our neuroscientific understanding hundreds of years ago looked nothing like what it looks like today, we just didn't know that these physical processes were happening in our brains. In fact, Descartes famously thought that the soul, the Cartesian ego, was in the pineal gland of the brain, and so that you didn't have to have all this other brain activity in order for something to be happening. But one of the things that we've discovered by doing neuroscience is that there are no mental changes that we are aware of. There's no non-controversial mental changes that we're aware of that do not also have physical correlates. So we know of nothing mental happening in our experience. If we're limiting our evidence to our experience, we know of nothing mental happening without something material also happening in a brain. But that might not always be the case in the future. We might be able to create a computer made of silicon that also has mental properties. So I don't want to say that all minds must imply something brain or imply something physical like a brain. I want to say that they imply something physical like a complex physical structure.
Yeah, and I'll say one last thing because I feel like I've been asking. I want you to push back anywhere you want, but I think there's an issue there with within our limited experience. I mean, I've never experienced a mental change while simultaneously experiencing a brain change. We assume, and I think rightly so, that because in however many studies have been done on these things, we see that when there is a mental change, there is a physical change. But I don't see how you can go from that to make a universal claim. And the last thing I'll say is, it seems like at best, because I whenever you push back, I'd like to see where you think I would disagree with you on the evidences you use to support your argument from physical minds, which, as I said in our phone conversation, I think it should be more appropriately, and this is going to be a mouthful, of course, that an argument for non or immaterial minds that are caused by or supervene on physical stuff or matter, not just physical minds, because I think it's a bit misleading to some who aren't familiar with this to say that these are physical minds, when by that you mean an immaterial thing that supervenes on something physical. But I think at best, even if I conceded what you're saying, it doesn't seem to rule out the existence of the soul. At best, it seems to rule out the possibility of disembodiment, namely that, in other words, if I concede your argument, it seems all I have to concede is that I cannot survive the death of my body, that when my body goes, so does my soul. But it doesn't seem to rule out the possibility of a soul existing within the body, if you will. So in other words, it doesn't show there is no soul. At best, it would show that I cannot survive disembodiment.
Okay, so there's a good deal there. So let me I'll try to pick it out as best I can, and hopefully I'll touch on all the key points. So one of the things that you said is that you've experienced a mental change, a mental event. You've experienced that, but then you said that you hadn't experienced a physical event.
In other words, going back to being young, I experienced mental changes, but I don't know, but I can't, in other words, I've never looked at my own, I'll just put it this way. I've never looked at my own brain and saw brain states changing when my mental states change. I just assume, and again, rightly so, I think, that happens based on what we know on other instances and the handful of times that neuroscientists have looked at the brain and looked at and talked to their patients and assume they're reporting mental changes.
So I think what you want to say is that you haven't observed the brains in your event, because what I'm afraid of by using the say experience physical events is that we're mixing those language games again. Experience belonged in that mental language game, whereas how we would describe our observations about brain states would use that physical language game. So it's with that clarification out of the way. Another one of the discoveries, at least starting with Freud and certainly getting much better over the past 100 years, is that a lot of our mental events are caused by unconscious events in our brain. Now, Freud was obviously very wrong about a lot of the particulars of this. However, the paradigm has certainly shifted in the fact that a lot of the decisions that we make and experiences that we have are caused by unconscious events in our brains. So I would say that that's a datum. That's a part of the evidence. I gave 5 lines of evidence. That would be part of those 5 lines of evidence. Because you were wondering how I'm moving from those 5 lines of evidence to this universal claim. And again, I would want to be careful of what we mean by universal claim, because it almost seems like you're saying, well, how do you make, how are you proving this? How are you entailing this? I'm not doing that. I'm making a probabilistic claim, and I understood the philosophy of science as an inference to the best explanation being an inference to the most probable hypothesis. And so I want to say that the 3 claims that I was defending, mind necessarily supervenes on physical properties, no mental differences without physical differences, et cetera, make better sense. They're better explanations of those 5 facts that I laid out. So I'll just give one right now that I think is the most interesting one. It's the idea that minds and their psychological traits are physically related by genetics. So if we're talking about mental substances, if something like consciousness was the property of an immaterial substance, such as a soul, and that those things like personality and memory were essential to that, it's very surprising that those such properties would be hereditable via genetics, that we could determine them via genetics. However, if we take my view, the neutral monist view, and those 3 claims that they laid out as the hypothesis that's compatible with neutral monism, this isn't surprising, because minds are physically dependent and genetics are physical things. So I think with all 5 lines of evidence, we can give similar ways of cashing out this inference to the best explanation. Now, does that prove it? Am I making some universal claim that is indubitable or is entailed by these 5 lines of evidence? No, it's a more modest argument than that. Now, the last thing you said was that this doesn't really seem to rule out the possibility of a soul, because it just might rule out that it's disembodied, that you couldn't have this soul that survived death or existed apart from a physical brain. So again, I take the meaning of soul. I take as an analytic truth that what we mean by a soul is an immaterial substance that is not tied to something physical, that can survive our physical death. That's why the substance dualist view seems so important, theologically important at least, is because you could have something like surviving death. If we're talking about a soul in a sense that doesn't survive death, it's not clear that we've put a view on the table that would respond to our religious concerns of something like an afterlife. And I also take it as analytic in at least in a theological context, because God is a purely non-physical mind. So God he's a mind, creates, there's nothing physical prior to a creation event. There's a creation event and everything physical comes into existence. I don't think it makes much sense to say that a soul or God imply something physical. And I think that's the attractiveness of the substance dualist view, is so that you don't have to say something like that.
It would to just and I'll turn it over here. So for example, I believe animals have souls, but I'm not sure that they survive the death of their bodies. So in other words, it seems like what you're arguing against would be more of a Cartesian dualist view, which I don't hold to. I'd go further and say, on my view, I hold to a Traducian view of the soul, and so a body presupposes a soul. So we're like almost on polar opposite ends there. That if you have a body, it presupposes that there is some soul that is the reason for its formation and existence. I would say, on my view, the soul is ontologically prior to the body. You have wholes that are prior to their parts, and we can go down that route if you wish. But and I have evidence for that, because on that view, on the substance view, the parts are inseparable in the sense that they cannot survive if separated from the substance. So if my arm is chopped off, it will cease to exist and lose its identity, which is evident by the fact that it's going to decay and just, go out of existence. Whereas for aggregate views, you take a tire off a car and it still remains, its existence and identity as a tire is still there. So on my view, you have the substance being ontologically prior to the body. So again, we're on polar ends there. And I think that the 5 facts, which I'd love to get into if you'd like later, I wouldn't reject any of those unless you think there's one I should. You talked about the hereditary thing. As I mentioned earlier, these would be empirically equivalent for both our views, because that's like saying, and again, back to the analogy problem, all analogies are going to break down at some point, but I don't see how saying that I have and on the Traducian view, my soul is intimately tied with my body. In fact, it's like a hand in glove, perfect kind of fit. In fact, the body that I have is a reflection of my soul. Now, that's not to say, which is why I think you're one of those facts you mentioned, when I don't think any of them would apply as being against my position. But in other words, you could have deformities or something going on in the physical that is going to inhibit the actualization of the capacities that my soul has. And sure, these things could be hereditary, but all that would show, in other words, on my view, it would just show that, okay, well, then there are certain physical actualizations or parts or powers that are required for me to be able to utilize the capacities that my soul has. Just like breaking a guitar string, as I mentioned earlier, would, maybe make me incapable of not playing a certain song or note. And if I did it to all the guitar strings, that wouldn't somehow show that, it rules out, that music is not physical or something like that. So in other words, I think we both have explanations for that, and it can't be used in favor of one view over the other.
Again, there's a lot on the table there, so hopefully I touch on the right parts. Here,
and feel free to interrupt me. I don't want to keep.
Oh no, you're fine. No, I don't want to. I know I don't want to play that game. So you seemed like you were saying that I was presupposing that you had a Cartesian dualist type view, whereas you would have some sort of other view. So really, all I've presupposed so far in the discussion is that you're an interactionist dualist, that there is some solution to the interaction problem, and that minds and brains are ontologically distinct. They are two separate substances. So I am surprised that you would say that you aren't a Cartesian dualist, but not because of what you've said so far about the mind, but because of what you've said about personal identity. The idea that there's what makes us the same thing through time is this irreducible feature of the world. And so that seems to me to presuppose something like a Cartesian ego, a ghost in the machine, if you will, to use one of the famous quips. This idea that there's, this little homunculus, so to speak, kind of behind our eyes, and it seems like that's where they reside, and that thing is what makes us the same person. That to me seems to imply some sort of Cartesian dualism, at least this idea that there's this irreducible. So I may, if I am uncharitably presupposing something Cartesian to you, I apologize. But it does seem strange, given some of the claims about personal identity, that you would be some other form of dualist. And I guess it's not really clear to me what that other form of dualism is and how it's substantively different than the dualism that I just characterized.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would say so. Cartesian dualism is a form of substance dualism, but kind of like in other words, you said, I don't remember how you worded it, but basically, there's a deeper connection on my view. Moreland calls it, I think, metaphysical, Aristotelian metaphysicalism or something like that, or metaphysical Aristotelianism, something fancy like that. He's also called it Thomistic-like substance.
Is it like the hypermorphism of
hylomorphism? It's close. It's close.
Okay.
Sure, yeah. Whereas on the Cartesian, it's kind of like it's almost like this soul is like almost interjected into a body. There's not this deep connection or unity, and it all focuses on the mental. Whereas on my view, the soul does far more than just the mind. The mind is simply a faculty of the soul, and this is where we get into the identity through change and other things like that. So on my view, given the Traducian view of the soul, without going into those details, basically, I have this specific body because of the specific type of soul. On a Cartesian view, you may be able to have some type of like a Freaky Friday type body switch. Whereas on my view, my body is, Moreland said something like, the body is an external realization of an internal structure. So if you want to know what kind of soul I have, you can look at my body, because my body would be an expression of the capacities of my soul. If I put a blanket over an object, you can't see the object, but you can see the form the blanket takes, and that gives you an idea of what's underneath the object, that ghost in the machine, if you will. But so it's a form. So Cartesian dualism is a form of substance dualism, but there are other forms, and the one I hold to is closely related with some of the other views, and not the Cartesian view.
So going back to make sure that I touch on all the previous things that you had said, you mentioned that you think that animals have souls. So, but you don't have this Cartesian dualist. So I assume you mean that there's something irreducible about non-human animals that makes them the same animal through time. Would that be a fair assumption to make?
Yeah, for the most part. So basically, this goes into the doctrine of a substance, or the notion of a substance, where you have something that is possessing these parts. So as a substance, I think, but I am not my thinking. I am a subject that thinks. You have something that is, the substance is the very thing that owns and grounds and unifies all these mental properties and other capacities that I have into one thing. And in other words, if an animal is conscious, as far down as we can tell, then we could say that on my view, that is, you can say that this animal has a soul, because you would need some type of immaterial substance to ground and
but
possess.
You're unsure. You conceded that you were unsure whether or not the souls of animals survive their death, which I thought was interesting, because why? We are animals. So what is ontologically, substantively different about the soul of an animal and our souls? Because it seems like if you're going to want to say that and non-human animals' souls don't survive death, that's going to be an ad hoc move, because it would be much more modest to say that, look, all souls survive death.
Yeah. Well, I'm not one for modesty, so.
You equivocated there. That's an equivocation.
I know. So yeah, no, it's a great question. And now this is where I would go. I would lean on my theological views, because you mentioned theology earlier, and I know some Christians might throw some tomatoes or rocks at me for saying this, but what I gave so far.
My job here is done.
There you go. In other words, everything that I gave earlier, I didn't have to appeal to anything theological to support those. These were philosophical, metaphysical arguments that I gave.
For sure.
So in other words, setting the theology aside, because there are non-theists who could believe in the soul. That's why I mentioned earlier, I guess, to clarify, that at best that would just show that my soul would depend on something physical. So in other words, you could still have the existence of the soul, even if what you're saying is true. So that was just kind of my way of showing that, that wouldn't rule out a type of substance dualism. Now, as far as the animal souls, again, good question. So this is where, again, I lean to my theology. And I think the reason we will survive death is because we're made in God's image. And there's a moral aspect to us bearing God's image so I've heard Moreland argue. So you look at something like the annihilation view, where Moreland would argue that it would be immoral for God to destroy something that bears his image. Given that animals don't bear his image, there's no guarantee, if you will, that these animals will survive the death of their bodies. So on that, even on my view, you have the possibility of a soul existing, but not surviving the death of a body. And again, I would lean on being made in the image of God. So I think it's a common misconception, among all sides, that a soul automatically entails some type of afterlife or eternality. I think the reason, again, we have an afterlife is because we're made in God's image, and animals are not.
Okay, so to come back to the last, again, to hopefully I touch on all the right things here, because you said you wanted to discuss my 5 lines of evidence. And so the move seemed to be that you want to concede all of those lines of evidence, and maybe I expect you to reject one of them. No, I don't expect you to reject any of them. So one of the hallmarks, I think, of a good argument is to appeal to premises that all parties can accept, readily concede. And so I want to say that all 5 of these lines of evidence are datums within neuroscience. And so the move seemed to be to say that you're ready to concede those, and that our views are going to be empirically equivalent. And that where both of our views are going to be able to predict this data the same. They're going to have the same explanatory power. So this is where I'm going to have to turn to the philosophy of science now, because I'm going to have to say, okay, if we're going to make that move about the posterior probability judgments, now we have to appeal to something like the intrinsic probability or the prior probability of our hypothesis, because I'm going to want to say that in order to predict those 5 lines of evidence, your view is going to have to be much less modest and much less coherent than mine. You're going to have to, it's going to come at theoretical costs. And so that I'm still going to end up at the same conclusion, but not because of a posteriori probability judgment, but because of a prior probability judgment. So I'm going to want to say that in order to predict those 5 lines of evidence, it's going to require ad hoc moves. So to use the genetics example, I think there's a readily explanation given by my simple hypothesis. But in order to predict the genetic properties, the mental properties that are heritable by genetics, is going to require additional assumptions on the substance dualist view, assumptions that my view doesn't have to make. So that's the modesty is going to also be a cost. But there's also going to be a cost of coherence, because by making these additional claims, you're going to introduce problems of coherence. The interaction problem we've already covered, but now I think it's a good time to segue into what I think is a problem of coherence, is the pairing problem. So the pairing problem says if let's just suppose a substance dualist view for now. And that means that there is this ontologically distinct substance. Okay. Now, what is it that makes it the case that this irreducible mental substance is paired with a particular brain in the physical world? Why can't an immaterial, I could ask, why can't my mind control you, Eric, your arm? We can't appeal to something physical to say that there's something physical which prevents my mind from controlling your body, because we've already supposed that the mind is non-physical. So it's not going to be constrained by something physical like the conservation of energy. So what is it? How do we explain why a mental substance, a mind, is paired with a particular brain? I think my view, the monist view, gives a ready example for that, because it's physically dependent, because you can't have this mind without that particular arrangement of matter. And if you were to have some other arrangement of matter, you would have some other mind. And so again, this is where I think that it's, in order to explain this pairing problem, you're going to have to appeal to assumptions that are going to lower the prior probability of your hypothesis. And that's how those 5 evidences are still going to, even if I can see that they're empirically equivalent, that our views have equal explanatory power, I'm going to then, in the philosophy of science, shift my claim and say, well, my view is still the more probable view because it has a higher prior probability, because it's more modest and more coherent.
Yeah. So a few things in that. So I don't see how the last thing you said, I don't see how that'd be the case, because a number of reasons. So I think the problem is it can typically be overstated in that. So you look at someone like William Hasker, who has an emergentist view, but is also a substance dualist. So in other words, everything you said, it would probably be consistent with his view, and yet he would still be a substance dualism. So this is kind of what I was getting at earlier by saying, in other words, when you're presenting a justification, it seems you want a justification that I'm going to have to reject and that your view would accept, to kind of make the point as clear as possible. But it seems everything you've said so far, someone like William Hasker could agree with, and yet he's a substance dualism, a substance dualist. Also, there's a difference between being physically dependent on something for it existing and functionally dependent on something that already exists to actualize its capacities or powers. So showing that there's some type of functional dependency wouldn't show that it equally means that something like my soul is ontologically dependent on these things. The reason I'd say I wouldn't have to reject any of those, and you said you don't expect me to, which I appreciate, is because while embodied, I would agree with all those things. And all that would shows that there's a cause and effect or dependence relationship while embodied. It wouldn't show that, which you already conceded. So yeah, I won't repeat myself there. Now the pairing problem you said, I think this also, I think the problem is either over exaggerated or underestimated, depending on how you look at it, because I think the pairing problem would have to apply to any position that's going to concede something immaterial, which we both concede something immaterial, at least consciousness. So, for example, why does consciousness itself arise from non-bits of unconscious matter? But also, why only one mind? Right? So you would concede there is some mind, but I'm assuming you would say there's only one mind. But why one mind? You have 100 billion atoms. You take away one, do you have a different mind, or are these like when you put them in half, there's two minds, and bring them together, it forms one mind? So I would say you'd also have that problem with why this on this particular thing. On my view of the Traducian view, my body is an expression, a mode, if you will, of my soul. So that's why there's only one. And unless we have reason to believe there should be more than one, or should be, there should be, it should have some kind of connection to something else. I don't see why that would be the case. Again, on my view, because my body is a result of, it's a mode of my soul. It's an expression, if you will, of my soul. That's why there would only be one. But on my view, you could have you could have a different substance causally interacting with my body. Again, appealing to the theology here, I believe in things like demon possession. So that wouldn't be anything against my view. If anything, that would be consistent with my view. And it may be the case that maybe one day I could control your body, with my mind. I don't know. But I think adding this kind of skepticism doesn't really, and I'm not saying you're necessarily doing this, but in general, adding this kind of skepticism doesn't really move the needle for me. And again, why this one and not why this on this body, not another, I think is a question for both our views. So I said it to say, it wouldn't count in favor of yours and against mine or anything like that. Not sure if you were telling that. But one last thing I want to say.
I think it would be a good place for here to be. So
Sure.
The nature of my claim, to clarify the nature of it, is that so we have this question. There's something that's in need of explanation. Why is my mind attached to this particular brain and not some other brain? And so the move earlier was to say that the 5 lines of evidence were empirically equivalent. Well, so if I'm going to concede that they're empirically equivalent, and that your view predicts those 5 things as well as mine, it's only because that you've made additional assumptions. Those assumptions you might use to then try to solve a pairing problem. I'm with you there. But the point I want to make is that comes at a theoretical cost. That what my argument is an inference to the best explanation. So, for example, I don't have to make additional assumptions in order to explain something like the pairing problem. The reason that our minds are dependent on a particular brain is because that our minds imply a particular complex set of matter. That nothing mental is going to happen unless a particular complex physical structure changes in some way. That's just an implication of my view. I don't have to. So that's why I would say that my view is more modest, because I don't have to appeal to some other set of claims in order to predict those 5 lines of evidence. And so that this is why the prior probability of my view is going to be higher than the prior probability of your view. Even though I've conceded that they have the same explanatory power, I'm still going to arrive at the same conclusion that my view, it's more probable that those 3 hypotheses I gave, that minds necessarily supervene on something physical, there are no mental differences without physical differences, and that all mental events have a sufficient physical cause. Those hypotheses, I think, are much more modest and don't take such a huge hit from something like the interaction problem or the pairing problem. You're absolutely right in the sense that both of these questions can be asked. It's just that by the nature of an inference to the best explanation, my views are going to be able to explain this using fewer resources that more coherently fit together. So go ahead.
You sure? You want to finish?
Oh, yeah. So I was going to try to use this as an opportunity to segue into the self, the idea of personal identity. But I realize I put a lot on the table there. And so, yeah, go ahead and respond to that. And then we'll try to segue into this, because I think we both want to cover a little bit more about the self and about free will.
Yes. Yeah, that'd be great. Okay. But it seems like your only solution is to just slap on the label that it necessarily supervenes, without explaining how it would have to or necessarily supervene.
Well, that's the hypothesis. So we're using 2 hypotheses to explain a set of data. My hypothesis is the simple one, that this is just necessary. But now you have to pull back. Then that's a modal claim that across all possible worlds, minds imply matter. But you have to say something less modest and say that, no, that relationship's only contingent, because purely immaterial minds, like God's mind and like the soul that survives our material death, can survive that. So I'm not just slapping a label necessary on it. It's a modal part of my hypothesis, one in which I think makes my view simpler.
Eric, I just want to say real quick. So maybe you could kind of address it in light of its theoretical virtues, because Ben's kind of using the philosophy of science, saying, "Hey, look, it's more simple. It has more, unifying explanatory power and better theoretical virtues." And I was wondering if you wanted to kind of address that aspect of it.
Yeah, so there's a difference of simplicity, ontological simplicity and epistemic simplicity, and it seems like I'm not sure which exactly, because sometimes people can switch between the two without realizing it. But I would also say that simplicity is more of a tiebreaker when all things are being equal. I don't think all things are equal here, because you look at something like basicality and naturalness. Immaterial consciousness is more natural and basic on my view, given that at the fundamental reality you have God. Whereas on a naturalist account, you don't have anything immaterial, and you're going to have to explain how some complicated chunks of matter are going to give rise to this immaterial and say that they're going to be necessary. I don't think that's more necessarily modest. I think it's just kind of preloading some necessity into it. And I would also say, though, those 5 lines of evidence he gave, I would have to disagree with at least. Well, I mean, again, even though I conceded them, I would say I think one would have to be false, even if I were to concede the rest. Namely, that how did you put it? Something about a mental change implies a physical change. Is that what you said? Or a physical
Yes.
change?
So one of the hypotheses that I won't appeal to is that all mental changes imply physical changes. There are no mental differences without physical differences. And so
which one comes first, on your view?
the physical.
Okay.
So I want to say that minds are complex. So mental experience might be fundamental and universal, but minds are complex things. Things like memory, personality, thoughts, desires, actions. These are all a aggregate of different physical causes that occur in different regions of the brain. So you might be able to have something like proto experience in something like a mollusk or some other non-vertebra that might have conscious experiences, but you're not going to have a mind. You're not going to have something that has thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories and desires. You're going to need, and so this is another one of the lines of evidence, is that mental capacities increase are directly correlated with neurons in brains. So as complex physical structures get more complex, our minds get more complex. We get much more richer minds, things that can do calculus and write poetry and love one another. And all of this is directly correlated with complexity in brains increasing.
Yeah, and like I said, I would to an extent agree with that, but here's where we kind of get to polar opposites, where on my view, the reason I have a complex brain is because I have a complex soul. So,
Well, that's interesting, because I thought a soul is supposed to be something very simple.
Right. So what
complex.
Moreland says, myriologically simple, but metaphysically complex. So it could be simple in the sense that it has no separable parts, but metaphysically complex in the sense that it could have different types of capacities and distinctions. So yes, it's simple in that there's no separable parts, but the complexity comes at the level of the metaphysics. So
this is interesting, because it seems like there's metaphysical complexity also added in there. So you mentioned ontological simplicity and epistemic simplicity. So obviously I'm appealing to epistemic simplicity, at least in the philosophy of science that I was trying to do, just saying that it's more modest. But ontological simplicity, I would obviously want to say my view is monist, your view is dualist. One is less than two. So it would be ontologically simpler in that sense. But it also seems like there would be this other sense, like I don't have to appeal to some sort of metaphysical complexity. I'm only have to appealing to physical complexity. So again, it seems like there's a theoretical. I get that you're saying you this is part of your hypothesis and that it helps you have the same explanatory data. but there's a theoretical cost, I think, that comes with this.
Right. So simplicity would be a tiebreaker, like I said earlier, for all things being equal. And I don't think there is this tiebreaker, because that's why I mentioned basicality and naturalness. But I want to the reason I had brought that other stuff up, the clarification, is that the physical difference come first, and then the mental difference. You talked about discoveries in neuroscience. One of a more relatively recent discoveries it has been done by some neuroscientists like Jeffrey Schwartz and Mario Beauregard has also commented on this, and they both have books on something similar, where Jeffrey Schwartz, one of the leading neuroscientists who study things like OCD and anxiety, in the nutshell, has basically shown that by thinking differently, you can change the chemistry and wiring composition of your brain. So in that sense, which would assume, this maybe segues into our free will thing, this assumes that you have a freedom of the will that transcends the physical, not caused by the physical. And these patients with OCD can change the chemical composition of their brain by thinking differently. So in this sense, you have the mental differences coming prior and causing physical differences. So it's a two-way street. And I would say that also lends support on my view. And I think, in fact, I would go as far as to say would be something against your view, because one thing we didn't get into is I don't see how you avoid epiphenomenalism, given that you are in some sense a property dualist, and you can't have this top-down causation. And to briefly explain that, you have a pile of boards that can be rearranged into a raft, and the pile of boards is what causes the raft, but the raft doesn't go top down and cause the boards. When you get to this top part, if these mental entities supervene on these physical things, structures, then you have this type of structural property, but then you have this just mental thing floating that doesn't have any causal power. And so I'll leave it at that, and just say that Mario Beauregard and Jeffrey Schwartz, I would say, have shown that it's a two-way street, and that you can have these mental differences that change the physical differences, which I don't think could be allowed on your view because of epiphenomenalism.
Hey guys, just so you know, we're going to try to wrap this up in a little bit. So go ahead and answer. You can answer what he said, Ben. And if you all want to discuss free will really briefly, but we're going to try to get to questions in about maybe 10 minutes or less. So,
I do want to say that I want to be respectful of time. And so if we talk any more about the self or free will, then hopefully that'll bear out in the question section. So I'll very quickly lay out the the deep disagreements that we're going to have here. So Eric and I had a very surprising and very refreshing agreement in the sense that we are both anti-reductionists about the mind. However, we have a very deep disagreement about personal identity. So while I'm an anti-reductionist about the mind, I am not an anti-reductionist about the self. I am a reductionist about the self, whereas Eric would disagree with that. And so hopefully we'll be able to talk about that more in the comments. And I think Eric might have already mentioned it. I can't remember if it was earlier in this conversation or the other night on the phone. But he's very right to say that I am a compatibilist about free will. So I'm going to be skeptical about something like top-down causation, what's often called agent causation. And again, my views on the self are going to be very relevant here, because I'm going to want to say that there is no irreducible agent that causes action. There are actions and there are consequences, but there is no agent in the sense of this irreducible feature. Now, that might sound a little paradoxical, and I realize in a certain way it is, because I think the simplicity of the concept of I or me is something that's very easy to just read into the world. Again, we could talk about both of these subjects for hours continuing after this. But as being respectful for time, I'll go ahead and end it there, and hopefully we can discuss it a little bit more if it comes up in the question section.
Yeah, definitely. Hopefully we can have a sequel show sometime, maybe to have that. Actually, I did want to use moderator privilege and ask one question if Travis wants to get them ready. That occurred to me, and both of you can answer this, because I was just thinking about it, since I know that animal souls were brought up a little bit earlier. My question to both of you is, as far as consciousness for non-human organisms, what is the simplest form? At what point does it start? I'm assuming you probably don't think plants are conscious. Is it bacteria? What's the simplest organism that you would consider consciousness, or that you would consider conscious, given your definition of conscious?
So I'll go ahead and start and say that I don't know. So one of the things that my view is compatible with is what's called panpsychism. this idea that something like proto-mental experiences, something like consciousness, might be fundamental or universal. And so it might be a sense, there might be some sense in which plants are conscious. It's just very, 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 very proto. I don't know. From my studying of the literature, most people think that mollusks and oysters are not conscious. However, there is still some disagreement on it. It requires much more complex physical structures in order to have what would be distinguishable for us as a conscious experience, something reacting to a stimuli in a way that we would say it's being caused to react that way because of a conscious experience.
Okay. Eric, did you have anything to
yeah. I would agree for the most part what Ben said. So a couple things to just add on to that, on my view, is first I'd say as a prerequisite ontologically, you would need a substance that can possess consciousness, not an aggregate. So an aggregate, again, would be a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure, and it's not a true whole. It's a loose connection of external relations, whereas a substance is a genuine true whole that can unite and possess and ground all these properties and capacities. So, and he can respond to this later if you want. I forgot to mention, because he mentioned that, there's a physical substance that is possessing these mental properties, but the brain and body aren't substances. They're aggregates. If you were to zoom in on a brain, it's a bunch of collection of parts. Same thing with the body. So these aren't true wholes, and I don't see how you can possess some kind of an aggregate can possess consciousness. So that would be like a prerequisite to something being conscious. Is it a true whole? Is it a substance, substantial whole in itself, or is it an aggregate? And then I would just agree with what Ben was saying regarding where we really don't know, but I would say anything that bears relevant similarity to how I behave, I would say we're justified in attributing consciousness to it. So, like I said, oysters, yeah, they don't seem to behave the way we do with certain inputs and outputs. So I think we're less justified in attributing consciousness to something like that.
Okay. Well, thank you both. Travis, I have not been following the comments section. So do we have comments or questions in the comments?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Let's see. First, we're going to start off with Jerry Louder. This is for Eric. Why does the soul attach to the brain and not the liver or pancreas or carotid artery? Even on the assumption that substance dualism is true, that specific fact about the attachment seems surprising.
Can I also just say I did not know that Jeff Louder watched our channel, so thank you, Jeff. I'm a big fan of your work, even though I'm a theist. I think it's really, you're one of the better atheists out there. So thank you for that question. And yeah, Eric, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, and thanks for the question, Jeff. So I don't think I've ever said the soul attaches to a brain. In fact, again, this is on my view of the soul. The soul is, in a sense, kind of diffused throughout the body, if you will. I've heard Moreland use the example of, you put sugar and water to mix it. It's kind of diffused throughout it. So it's not as if the soul is put it this way, the soul is to the body, is omnipresent to the body like God would be to space on a theological perspective. It's not that God is physically located in, but has causal active power in every point in space. So, when I wiggle my finger and then wiggle my toe, it's not as if my soul has to travel from my finger to my toe. The reason I would say maybe the question could be worded, why is the brain more associated closely with something like a soul? And I would think because that's probably the access point. And this is just pure speculation. The access point that the soul has its uses to have its causal influence upon the body. So I don't know if I'd say it's attached to the brain, but I mean, there is soulish totipotentiality, as I've heard it put, in every part of my body. My biological tissue is infused with this soulish totipotentiality.
Okay, Ben, did you have anything to say?
Yeah, so I think Jeff Louder is really hitting on something important here, because I think this is the thrust of the pairing problem. Because what is the essence of the pairing problem is that our minds are attached to a particular brain. So I've framed the pairing problem earlier as we need some sort of explanation, given what Eric was saying, that our minds are, this kind of universal thing outside of space and time. Why is it attached to this particular brain? But Jeff Louder is also showing another way in which the pairing problem emerges by saying, why is it brain and not some other organ. Again, my view has a ready explanation for this, is that minds imply those complex physical structures like brains, because it necessarily, like, that's why it's not a property of something like a digestive system or the photosynthesis in a plant or mitosis. It explains that. But I think Eric's going to pay some theoretical costs here, but to have to explain this question of why is this mind that is not bound by space and time attached to this particular brain rather than some other brain or some other organ.
Okay. Can I ask this is a question I've been wondering as well, and I think this is essentially the same thing. I didn't realize I had the term, but can we ask, theists typically hold God as omnipresent because he's immaterial, but would we ask not why the soul is attached, but how it can be attached at all? Wouldn't we expect an immaterial thing to be omnipresent because it's not confined by space and time, or is that not necessarily true?
I'll let Eric take that one. That's a really good question.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think so I kind of just have to go back to what I said about the causal active power is how we would kind of hash out omnipresence, and the soul has active power throughout this. But also, I would say that I don't. Maybe I'm missing something, but I don't see how that would be a problem, because also, in my view, you have this that a body would presuppose a soul, which is kind of like, again, the reverse of Ben's view. And then you also have the problem: how could anything immaterial supervene on something physical? I think we have yet to hear any explanation other than to say it necessarily does or requires it. But again, describing it, it doesn't kind of give us the reason why this happens. So on my view, you would need, while embodied, a complicated type of physical structure while I'm embodied. So to reiterate what I said earlier, my complicated brain is a reflection of my complicated capacities and power and structure of my soul. So maybe I'm missing something, but
okay. Well, can I, and I'll follow up on that, because I've been picking on Eric for this whole thing. So I'll ask Ben a question to try to do that. So this is somewhat related to this, but since he brought up the interaction thing, the one thing that I was just thinking of, Ben, is can we also, well, I know that you're an engineer, so you probably would know more about the physics than I do, but can we actually explain like, is there an ultimate explanation for causality, or is this something that we infer by observation? So do we know why energy is transferred, or do we just observe that it is and we just say it? Is there a deeper explanation for why, if two physical objects interact, energy is transferred, or do we just observe this? So can one also just say we observe it and that's just what it appears and there is no deeper explanation, and we could do that with the soul? Or do we have a more reductionist view of explaining exactly why something like that can happen, even according to physical objects?
So this is a super great question, and one that we could, again, talk about for hours longer than we have, because causation itself is very mysterious. If you don't believe me, just YouTube or Google quantum mechanics, and you will find that causation is a controversial concept in philosophy, and that there are many different views and ways of understanding what consciousness is. As an engineer and a scientist, I'm very skeptical that I would be able to fully explain causation using the tools that an engineer would use. So I'm going to say that I don't know. And I really haven't read enough of the literature on causation to even really sketch out the disagreeing views and where the disagreement lies and how you would try to resolve them. I'm much more confident in this philosophy of mind area. I would have to read much more on the philosophy of causation in order to answer that, or to even really gauge how close we are to answering that question. It's a very good question, very big question, and I'm going to use the traditional philosopher cop-out and just, I don't know yet.
Can Eric do that with the soul of saying, I don't know how they interact either, and just punt? Or is that
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
And because I think that's what he has to do. But so that's a move that I don't think the neutral monist has to make. The neutral monist is just going to say, whatever the causal explanation is for how they interact, it will obey the conservation of energy. Whereas the substance dualist is going to have to say no. The total energy isn't always constant. The mind can somehow reach out and change the net total energy in a isolated system like our body.
But can I push back there though? Because I still haven't. And granted, we don't have a lot of time, and we didn't have a lot of time. But I never heard an explanation of how you avoid epiphenomenalism, other than to say that this thing necessarily supervenes. And for those that we've been throwing that word around a lot, on epiphenomenalism, you have these mental states riding on top of, if you will, these physical structures, but these mental things cannot cause anything in turn. They just kind of sit there. What's your explanation for how you avoid them? Because let me just.
So I avoid them by the nature of the neutral monist position. So I don't think that there's this mental thing and this physical, this mental thing riding on a physical thing. I think there's one thing. I think there's one neutral substance. It's just described in two different ways.
But we're talking about properties and states. So
yes. And so those properties so if we were to say mental properties and physical properties, I'm with you. And that language seems to be like a property dualist type language. But I would say that no, these properties that we're talking about have to be cashed out in these two different language games. We're kind of stuck with the language game that comes along from the dualist tradition and the materialist tradition, and that it's just unavoidable. But there's only one substance, and we might say that this substance has various properties, and those properties can be described in physical terms and mental terms. But we're not going to be able to describe all of reality without these two language games.
So
these two language games capture something true about the world.
Well, sure, that there's at least two different properties, but if you're going to, okay, I guess two questions for clarification, because I want to really understand where you're coming from. Is the mind immaterial, and does the mind, the mental states and its properties, do they cause things?
Yes. So I think there's causation in the sense. So if I'm thirsty, that causes me to go get a drink of water.
Okay.
So yes, I'm going to want to admit that there is some sort of solution to this interaction problem, because our minds do cause our brains. How do I do that? What is the way in which I catch that out? That's the advantage of the neutral monist position, is that it says there's only one substance.
Okay.
So that there isn't this worry of the conservation of energy with that, because we're going to say that whole substance does it, and that's why we observe that the total energy in an isolated system like our body remains constant. We don't have to add some extra ingredient to account for the fact that we observe the total energy remaining constant.
But are you in agreement with me that the mind is not physical?
So I am agreeing that the mind cannot be entirely explained, cannot be wholly characterized in purely physical terms. Again, there's only one substance, but it's going to require, and this is going to be a little bit misleading, and it's because of the nature of it. You might say there's only one property, the property of the brain, but you have to explain the brain using mental and physical terms. You can't explain everything there is about the property of being a brain without using mental language and physical language.
I could explain the brain without using mental language, but I cannot explain the immaterial mind without using mental language. But my point is okay, because you keep saying there's one substance, right? The property dualist agrees there's one substance, but says that there's this extra property that's mental and non-physical, and that's why there's a language game, because it points to an ontological distinction.
So I want to go back to what you just said, though. So if you explain the brain in entirely physical terms, then you've left out the mental. If you explain the mind in nothing but in mental terms, you've left out the physical.
Sure.
Because we both agree, again, we've both conceded that our minds have brains. So,
okay.
So it's there was not the symmetry, like what you just said suggested that there was some sort of symmetry there, or symmetry breaker that your view had that mine didn't. But I want to deny that, say that no, it's in order to accurately describe the world. So go back to property language again, the property of being a brain. So we all agree that there is such a property in the world. but that property cannot be characterized without using both mental and physical terms. Because now you might say, okay, I can describe a brain in purely physical terms. No, I don't know what it's like to be a bat. If I were to cut your skull off and look at all the facts about your brain, I still wouldn't know what chocolate tastes like to you. I wouldn't know what a strawberry tastes like to you. I wouldn't know what sand feels like to you. Again, we're not going to be able to fully describe this property of being a brain without appealing to these mental terms. Again, to use the coin analogy, we can look at the brain. It has a certain phenomenology in physical terms, but it also has another phenomenology in mental terms. I might be able to look at one side of the coin at a time, but I have to, when I turn it over to look at the other side, I'm no longer looking at the other one. So and that's the symmetry.
So you're saying that there are things true of the mind that are not true of the brain and vice versa. Is that right?
So that's going to be, it's going to be dependent on how you understand that claim.
If only we had yes or no answers.
This is a typical philosopher response to the question, because it seems like there should be just a straightforward answer to it, but it's going to depend on how you understand that claim. So, because if you say there's things that are true of the mind that are not true of the brain, that's almost seems to presuppose the substance dualist language.
Just a property dualist. Really?
Well, again, our dualism of properties, fine. I'm in the monist tradition, I think, in wanting to say that there's one substance, or in this case, one property, the property of being a brain, but it's going to require us to describe it in two different ways, using two different language games. Those two different language games are going to capture something true about it.
But that seems incredibly ad hoc and changes like a lot, because I was under the assumption that you agreed with me the mind was a material. But if you're going to say the mind's physical, that brings up a whole other issues, that we didn't get into.
Well, so I am saying that. So it's the argument for physical minds. So minds do imply something physical. Like there are no mental changes. That's just part of my hypothesis.
But are not identical to anything physical.
They're not identical. No, in the sense that we can't reduce them. We cannot. We cannot say that minds this language game is identical to this language game. We can't. That's what I'm saying.
I'm not talking about language. I'm not talking about language. I'm talking about.
But that's my theory. My theory is saying that there's these two languages. There's one substance, two language games.
Right.
But wouldn't that reflect
this language game is not identical to this language game? Now, if you want to call this language game mind, and you want to call this language game brain or physical, then yes, the mind and brain are not identical. They're not reducible.
Travis,
well, you're talking about language,
yeah,
talking about ontology, but go ahead, Travis.
Sorry, guys, we didn't want to break it up. We just had a lot of questions to get to.
Yeah, I know. We could talk about this all night.
If only we
were going back and forth so good. I didn't want to interrupt.
If only we could keep these a yes or no questions, that would be. But I don't think any of these answers are yes or no as simple as that.
Because it depends on what we mean. I really.
This is like Jordan Peterson. Well, it depends on how you mean this or define this. It's never just a straightforward.
It depends on your point of reference. Right?
Yeah, exactly. All right, Travis, what's the next question?
Okay, so Jeff Louder did ask quite a bit.
Okay.
So let's get to his next question for you, Eric. What is a, quote, immaterial substance? I know what a material substance is. I don't understand what an immaterial substance is. It sounds like immaterial material.
Yeah, well, he needs to read some Aristotle, because the word substance was first used by Aristotle, and it was to allude, and he used it in different contexts, but basically he was referring to you have something that stands under the properties that it owns. So you look at something that has properties, and then the substance was the thing that stands under and owns and grounds those properties. So I know it's used a lot in science, but it was first used in philosophy by Aristotle. And that's probably why there's a confusion there, because if you look at Aristotle, immaterial substance was, from the beginning. Now the real question is, what is a substance? Setting aside immaterial material, and there's like 4 or 5 key characteristics of substance. It's something that unifies its properties. It's a continuant through change. It is something that is ontologically prior to any parts. Where to just really quickly, for substances, you look at like I am a substance. I'm an immaterial substance, but nevertheless a substance. And what grounds everything is this soul that is a substance. And when you remove parts of my body from the substance as a whole, then those things no longer, they lose their identity and cease to exist, because For substances, the parts ontologically depend on the whole. When you look at aggregates, which are not true wholes, not substances, then their parts exist and have their identity independent of the wholes of which they're part. Like a tire from a car is still a tire, even when it's not part of a car. So, yeah, that's probably where the problem is. That you look up the history of what it meant to be a substance.
So,
Okay.
Eric, just as a follow, like really short, does this mean that all things have substances, or is it only conscious things? Because I think some people like Plato and others might have argued that everything has forms, right? Or is that your position, or no?
So good question. There may be physical substances, but these would be like have to go into like the atomic theory of matter, where basically it's something that you can't break down any further. Like a book or Lego bricks. You know, it's an easy example. These are aggregates. They're not true substances because they're not true wholes. You can take apart the Lego bricks, and again, you know, they're still Lego bricks, independent of being part of, you know, a castle or whatever that you build out of them. So a substance, I would say, just for the sake of time, is something that you're not going to be able to break it down further. It doesn't require anything else to classify what it is in its species, if you will.
All right, thank you for that answer. I think that was a good answer.
Ben, did you have anything? Did you want to touch on that?
I could touch on it real quickly because I think what Jeff's question here helps make clear is the simplicity of my view. So his question, I think he's right in saying that it almost sounds like, so we know what a material substance is. We see substances persist through time and have various properties. But to postulate this additional substance, this additional ontological feature of the world, an immaterial substance. But then when we start talking about what this immaterial substance is, it seems to have similar properties that material things have. The interaction with material things, the pairing with material things. And so it seems like immaterial material. And so the neutral monist avoids it by saying, like, look, you avoid that by saying there's only one substance. It's only one thing that has properties. You have to describe these properties in two different ways. Property or neutral monism has also been described as dual aspect theory. This idea that there's one thing, but it has two aspects to it. Maybe that will help. So there is no immaterial material. We can avoid that seeming complication within the neutral monist view.
The only other thing I will say about this comment is that I believe it's an immaterial substance, not a material substance, but I won't quibble.
Oh, nice.
No offense to Mr. Lau.
Got him.
So, Ben, is part of your case basically, like, you know, using the theoretical virtues that you don't have to you don't have this burden of tacking on theoretical complexity to solve isolated problems, and that it's going to have a theoretical advantage in that aspect?
Absolutely. So I think that just again, to go back to Jeff Lauder's question here and how that helps us here, is that my view is a monist view. It's more modest than the dualist view of adding additional substances. So I can explain all of the data. So the data being the 5 observations, right, by only using one substance. Whereas the substance dualist has to explain. Now we're going to say they have the same explanatory power. If I'm going to concede that point, it only does so by adding something extra to the world, an extra ingredient, an immaterial substance. And not only does that bring the problem of lesser modesty, but then we have that coherence issue too. This idea of, when we start to really dig at what we mean by an immaterial substance, it starts to sound like immaterial material. And it seems like we have this kind of incoherence there. And I would want to say that that's the feature that's what changes the prior probability. There's a theoretical cost. In order to get the same explanatory power to explain the same data, it has to be less modest and less coherent. That's the thrust of my case.
Can I jump in here, because there's a lot of atheist philosophers of minds who are going to make the same claim against Ben's view, because he keeps referring to one substance, but I would say he's at the very least a property dualist, because there's 2 different properties. Now he I'm going to say it this way. He punched to talk, saying it's a difference of language, but I think that language points to something ontologically distinct, that there's a different kind of property. So now if you have, and there were a whole bunch of quotes, and of course I didn't order them, but you have someone like D.M. Armstrong. He says it's not a particularly difficult notion. When the nervous system reaches a certain level of complexity, it should develop new properties, nor would there be anything particularly difficult in the notion that when the nervous system reaches a certain level of complexity, it should affect something that was already in existence in a new way. But it is quite a different matter to hold that the nervous system should have the power to create something else of a quite different nature from itself and create it out of no materials. Some other philosophers of mind say that if you're going to add these other properties, then it really doesn't deserve the name of materialism or physicalism. So you have on Ben's view, and let me say it this way first. On my view, I'm not adding anything, because on my view, it's basic and natural at the fundamental level to have minds that are immaterial. On Ben's view, you would depending on who you talk to, but it seems like if everything's just one substance, then what room or need is there to fit anything immaterial or have a different language to describe something? Well, now he is adding in something immaterial or seemingly immaterial that we have to use immaterial language games, if you will. And now you're adding in something that has no justification or even predictability that we would expect if we just look at the subvenient bases and parts.
Right on. Hey, Travis, you got that next question? We're going to try to get through these a little quicker. So we'll probably just give you guys like 1 minute to respond, and then, we don't want to, exhaust, you guys, and we already had it's
Eric and I could do this all night.
Hey,
Bring
man,
it.
I'll tell you what, it's a good conversation when one of your co-hosts actually has to go. You're not going to apart, right? All right, so Travis, hit that next one, man.
Okay, so this one I'm going to skip down. This one's for Ben. We wanted to do a question for him. It's from Finding Truth. Welcome, Santi. And he says, for Ben, what do you think about the Chinese room argument? And what differentiates a computer from a human brain? In other words, how can the mind arise in a brain but may not be possible for a computer?
Right. So this is great question. So my view, I've actually kind of appealed to John Searle's work here a little bit already. And for those that are unfamiliar with the Chinese room argument, it's an argument given by John Searle that say that, look, we might be able to simulate or replicate behavior using a computer, but that doesn't imply that the computer understands or thinks or has these properties that we would have in minds. So I'll try to make this as quick as possible. The Chinese room experiment is, you imagine yourself, there's this machine, but inside it is a person, and they have a book with all kinds of Chinese letters in it, and how to respond to these Chinese letters. And so people will slip in papers with Chinese symbols written on them, and then you just you look up that Chinese symbol, and you're supposed to say this, and you do that, and then you slip it back through. And so the person on the other side goes, oh, okay, this computer understands me. That's not necessary. That isn't the case, because John Searle and someone like myself, we don't understand Chinese. All we're doing is following a code. And so what he's going to want to say is that it takes more than just raw computing power in order to have what we would call a mind. And so this is where John Searle uses this argument to kind of springboard into other, he's laid out a theory of intentionality and stuff like that. And so I would just say that I concede the Chinese room experiment, and my view is very close to John Searle's view. And so we would both want to insist that something like a mind is a higher order biological feature, like digestion or mitosis or photosynthesis. And that it's because we don't understand all of those processes that go into making a mind yet, as to why, the strong AI is not there yet. But neither Searle nor I are ruling out the possibility that in the future we could have something like a computer that has much more experience. we're not there yet. We just don't know it yet. And this is the one of the uses of philosophy, is to come in and show the limits of what something like science has actually shown.
Okay.
All
Eric,
right.
did you have anything real quick on the Chinese room experiment?
No, I mean, I have a lot to say, but like Ben said, we can do this all night, so we can just move on to the next question.
Okay, so we'll go to one from Jeff. For Eric, if substance dualism is true, can immaterial souls emerge in purely immaterial mental reproduction?
Engage in purely
engage.
mental reproduction.
Yeah, thank you. Can two unembodied minds spawn a third child mind? How does that work? Really interesting question.
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, I'll just say probably not.
But I think you'd have to say something like that, because again, if you could see the datum that mental properties are related by genetics. So if there's a mental property,
well, let me say this, because here's where I think which again, there's so much we didn't get into. So everything has a nature, and I'm talking about essentialism here. So you're a human, I'm a human, we have a nature, and within our nature, there's essential capacities. So every human has the essential capacities for things like developing language, having consciousness, things of that nature. However, there can be physical defects that impair or prohibit the development or actualization of certain capacities and powers that we have. So all this hereditary thing would be passing on defects that inhibit what's already within the essence and nature of my soul. So at best, and this is why I say they have both explanations. I think, of course, the explanations are better in my view, but all that would be showing is that there are things that inhibit the powers that are already within my soul. So this genetic thing at best, again, would just go to show that there needs to be certain developed capacities or parts of my body for me to actualize the powers within me, but it wouldn't do anything to show that there could be immaterial spawn children that are mental. And the last thing I'll say is, on my view, a body presupposes a soul. So there's this deep connection that my soul was naturally made to be embodied. That's the natural state of the soul, is to be embodied. So that's why I say I don't think so, because I think it's natural for me to be embodied, and that's the way in which I can reproduce. Now, I could be wrong about that, but yeah, I don't think it's a terribly good question against anything for or against my view. So.
Ben, did you have anything you wanted to add to that real quick?
30 seconds.
No, I think I've pressed the things that I would want to say there. I think I've already pressed.
Okay,
so I'll try to use our time.
Okay. Well, we just have two questions left. And
okay.
So we'll go to the next one. That's for you, Ben. Once again from Santi, Finding Truth. I was late, but I have a question for Ben. What is mind? How do you explain the transmission of data from a human brain to another if such data or information seems not to be materialistic?
Well, so I would want to say that the transmission of that data is, in at least some sense, physical. So I want to start with what is the mind? Big philosophical question there.
Sure.
And so I think that's characterized by the neutral monist view. And so I would want to say things that a mind is a property of a particular brain that has thoughts, emotions, desires, acts, conscious experiences, and so that all of these things are what constitute mind. And so how would you explain the transmission of data from a human brain to another? It would be the interactions of brains, bodies, voice, perception, cognition. There would be a whole big array of explanations. But as the neutral monist, I would say there are going to be some features in which we have to appeal to those mental concepts. We're going to have to use the mental language game. So we could characterize all of this, how data is transmitted between individuals in entirely physical terms, but we would be leaving something out. We have to make use of those mental concepts.
Okay. Eric, did you have anything on that real quick?
I'd still like to know how mind causally interacts with the brain at all.
Yeah.
But I mean, we'll just
they're the same
rehashing
substance.
That's a really good question.
But we're not talking about substances, though. See, I'm not saying that because when you're
But the
talking about
neutral
supervene,
monist is so that's the neutral monist view, is that there's one substance.
right,
And
right.
so-
But this substance is going to produce or supervene or cause something that cannot be described in physical language, right? That's your position.
So there is going to be a supervenience relation between certain features of aspects. We'll use hopefully this aspects of our brain and our what we're saying as mind. And so there's no difference of substance. It's all one substance.
Right.
And that there is causation occurring in that. But to describe that causation, we have to use mental and physical concepts in order to get the whole truth of that single substance that causally interacts. So these are different parts. So there's causation happening in our brain, and we will describe that causation in mental terms, and we will describe that causation in physical terms.
So I disagree, but I'm still unclear, though. You have one substance, let's grant there's one substance, but it's causing, or there's some relation that is producing somehow some mental thing. Yes?
No, there's nothing. There's nothing over and beyond that substance. We describe that. No, we describe that substance in mental terms and physical terms.
So you're
physical
saying
concepts that are extended in space and time, and concepts that are first-person subjective. So experience, what its likeness. So it's that there's these two ways of describing reality here. We can describe reality in a what its likeness way, and in a extended spatial space-time way. And so that these two descriptions, these two sets of concepts, the language games that give rise to these concepts, are essential to describing the one substance. And causation occurs in that one substance.
Yes, but you're saying when we're describing this with this language game, we're describing mental things. In your view, you're describing a physical substance.
So you're describing mental things. So
but
right by saying that, you're already using the mental language game. So I'm going to say yes. I have to say yes. But I'm also going to insist that there's physical language games that have to be described there too.
Okay, and well, the last thing I'll say is, and we disagree, of course, is that even if you're saying one substance, I don't see how the brain and body could be seen as a genuine substance and not an aggregate.
And with that, we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, because like you said,
you know what?
This all night.
What I'm experiencing here, and guys, you've blown my mind. I mean, you guys are
visible mind or immaterial.
You guys are. I was going to ask you. So, you guys agree there's a soul?
Yeah,
that's what it sounded like.
But no, like seriously, guys. I mean, this is phenomenal, and you do our channel a service for putting all this out there. I mean, you guys could have written a book on this. You guys could have collabed. And, oh my, I'm flabbergasted.
Well, I do want to say that so Eric and I think we did our legwork before. We exchanged opening statements beforehand.
Right,
we had a phone call where we tried to resolve as many disagreements about meaning as we could, so that we could have a substantive discussion, so that people could watch it and walk away with I hope people will be able to walk away with a lot of questions that will keep them up at night. Because if they're going to keep me up at night, y'all deserve to have them.
Are you trying to give people insomnia?
Yeah.
But hey, guys, seriously though, I mean, it's been great, and I would love a part 2. I know both you guys are busy, and like I said, you guys honor us. I mean, your guys are the reasons that this show is what it is. So I would love a part 2.
I think we should definitely do a part 2 on at least the self and free will. So those were two rabbit holes that we just really didn't get.
That's a 2 and 3, Blake.
Yeah, we had it's our deep disagreements are about the self and free will, whereas we have the anti-reductionist view in common about the mind. So I certainly think it would be not only an interesting and fun conversation to have, but also useful for an audience to hear how two very deep disagreements about the self, and free will interact with one another.
Of course. Yeah, is that it, Travis? Was that the last question?
There was
Finding Truth that did say that, hey, Ben and Eric, thank you guys for this conversation. It
Thanks,
was really
Sandy.
good.
That really means a lot coming from him.
Thank you.
Well, you guys are awesome.
I think Jeff had one last one for Eric.
I'll also plug the Finding Truth channel, so I'll be there next week having a discussion with Glenn Peoples on the problem of hell. It's Sandy and Glenn are both really great guys, so I'm really looking forward. I'm hoping that the discussion could be as good as this one.
Well, the phenomenal thing is when you get two stellar guys like you together that can just talk about these things and there's no insults being thrown and stuff like that. It makes these type of conversations like, this is what we should have. This is what we should be doing. It's not, me versus you and I'm just going to try to one up you. It's, hey, let's talk this out. And that's what this is all about. And that's what PRA has always been about, and that's why we try to push those conversations to that degree. And I know Travis and me, we both don't put up with those type of behaviors, so when they come on this show, they know. So, but yeah, is that it, Travis, or we got one more?
There was one last question, and it's a good question. It's a question I wondered about before I became a theist. For Eric, do souls get created at the moment of conception, or do souls exist prior to attaching to a zygote, embryo, or fetus? Why don't we have memories of a pre-birth experience?
Yeah, good question. And before I answer that, because I know we're going to close, I just want to say also thank you. Appreciate the compliments. You guys are too kind, but you need to meet more people and get out more because, we barely scratch the surface. And I very much appreciate Ben just being respectful and cordial. I think it was a good conversation. My only concern is we went through a lot of terminology. We really did barely scratch the surface. And there's a lot of technical terminology that for time's sake, we didn't unpack. And we still, and it still was not enough time, in my opinion. It flew by. So I apologize to anybody who's not familiar with these issues in advance. We're not in advance afterwards, because again, there's a lot of things we just kind of ran through because both Ben and I are pretty familiar with the material and jargon. Okay, so to the question. So to reiterate, and this is why I said that, I hold to a Traducian view of the soul. So Jeff may not be aware of that view, and that's fine. Not everybody's, stays up at night like me and Ben thinking about these things. So on the Traducian view, and this is probably going to open up another can of worms. So I'll say it this way. On the Traducian view, given that my soul is diffused all throughout my body, there is a possibility, or metaphysically speaking, when two things come together with the solar study potentiality, you can have a new soul come into existence. So I would say a starfish has a soul. It's a type of first mover. It's a true whole. But when you sever a starfish arm, that severed arm has a potential to become a new starfish. On the Traducian view, you have the type of soul that you have in the body that you have, in part, in some sense, because of the parents that brought you together. So that being said, to reiterate what I also already said, because this all ties in, having a body presupposes there's a soul, because on my view, again, the substance is ontologically as a whole is prior to the parts. So if there's any parts, it presupposes a whole. And again, my body's an external realization of an internal structure. So my body is a, quote, reflection, if you will, of my soul. And I have the kind of body that I do because of the kind of soul that I have, along with its powers and capacity. So the reason I have eyes is because my soul's nature has the capacity for sight. And when you look at my brain, it's associated with certain complexities like Ben was getting at, which is why I say I agree, because of the type of capacities my soul has for thinking and whatnot. So the view that he seems to be describing is more akin to what's called a creationist view of the soul, where God, to oversimplify, God zaps or creates something and in a sense puts a soul in the body, if you will. And again, that's a gross oversimplification, but on my view, it's there from the beginning. There's a substantial change that happens and it forms a body. On a creationist view, there can be, in a sense, God, quote, putting a soul into a body, but hopefully that answered the question.
Absolutely. Ben, I don't know if you had anything on this particular question you wanted to throw in real quick, or
Yeah, so I'll just say something really quick. So again, I think what this is going to come down to is now we have another datum that we can add. So I misspoke and said there were 6 lines of evidence, and when there were only 5. Let's add a sixth. A sixth is that we don't have memories
Eric wins.
prior to our. We don't have we don't have memories prior to our birth, and so that this seems kind of surprising given this substance dualist view. And so that there's this question: when does the soul attach itself to the body? And so that we have to answer this question. And so that Eric is going to have to make some additional claims here to try to explain this. And so he distinguish between different views here. But I would want to emphasize that I think that this comes at a theoretical cost that my view just does not have to pay. Because again, to give my view, there's our minds. When I talk about the mental language game that we use to describe our minds, that's an abstraction from one aspect of a single substance. Whereas the brain or the physical language game, the physical concepts we use, are an abstraction the other way of this substance, of this single substance. So the question is answered. There's a readily answer. That explains why there is no memories prior to our birth. It's because something like memories are the result of a complex physical structure, where that complex physical structure is one abstraction of this single substance, and our minds emerged, where the mind is this mental language game that's an abstraction from the again, one single substance. So I think Eric's view is going to have to pay a theoretical cost in order to answer this question in a way that my view just doesn't have to pay.
Well, I didn't exist prior to my birth, so there'd be no memories if I didn't exist. And if I were to get knocked out or something, I wouldn't have memories of being in a coma. So nor do I have memories of being asleep.
You would say that your body didn't exist. The physical portion of you didn't exist. But again, if on the substance dualist view, if mental life is the property of a soul, and that soul isn't something physical, it's outside of space and time. Again, we come back to that kind of, isn't it omnipresent? Sure. Isn't there's something there, like, and the properties of our memories. This applies also after death. If we
so here's why though is.
Do we have those properties, or if we suffered from dementia, is that a property of the soul?
So I think all these are easily answered. Of course, we don't have time for all of them, but just to briefly touch on them, so there's a difference between ultimate capacities and first order and second order capacities. Everyone who's human within their soul has the ultimate capacity to develop consciousness, but this was going to require some physical development of certain parts of my body to be actualized for me to utilize the capacities I have. If you, for example, if you pluck out my eyes, I wouldn't be able to see. But if hypothetically you can put in some type of prosthetic eyes, if you will, then I'd be able to see again. So it's not as if I lose the capacity of my soul, but I lose the parts that are necessary while embodied to utilize these capacities. So it's really not a problem at all for my view, and it goes hand in hand and is expected on my view.
Right on. Well, we all know that Ben needs Jesus, so that's why we're.
I'll let everyone decide whether or not
don't worry, Ben. I tell my Christian co-hosts that they're all heretics. So,
right. David Baldwin, that means you.
Oh yeah. He tricked us last time, but well, guys, hey, look, man, I really appreciate you guys coming on, and I would love to do a part 2 to this. I would love to. I mean, I sat here, my mind was blown. I mean, you guys have, Eric, you said I don't get out enough, man. I'm a master's student in apologetics and philosophy, man. And this stuff is even like, this stuff has gone way, way deep. I still hold to the fact that we get more on independent study than we do just school study. So, it could go both ways, but at least school formalizes it for us. But guys, man, it was great, and I truly thank you guys for coming on and being here. Travis, thanks for doing your best in this moderation. Guys, I was trying to keep up with the comments and get the questions to you guys. But
yeah, I thought it went well.
I truly do, and you know what, you guys are smiling. I'm glad you guys had fun. You know, and again, I hope you can do it again. You know, it might take me another year because Eric's so busy, but I hear you. It happens. It happens. But next, I mean, this is the last show we're doing for this month. So the next show you see is going to be part of guest host month. Now, PorA is very interactive with its guests, its former guests, and its members, right? We actually give the podcast to our guests in the month of February to guest host. So they get to be the host. They get to control the conversation. And, you know, it only took me about 20 minutes of talking before I had 5 shows booked. So we got that next month, guys. Come back, stay tuned in. We thank everybody for being here. I just want Eric and Ben to say a couple things about their ministries and their non-ministries.
Right.
And talk a little bit about
That's
themselves.
how you know I'm a theist, if I called it my ministry.
right,
Yeah.
right. I didn't want to go that far.
Just let us know like how we can find you, what you're working
Yeah,
on.
exactly. Just let us know. I'll let Eric go first.
Yeah, thanks. Easiest place to kind of see what I'm doing is either Facebook or YouTube. I don't really keep up with my website really in a few years. Just ever since I got with Texas Baptist, anything I do is going to be posted either on my Facebook ministry page, my personal page, or the Christian Apologetics 101 page. So that'd be something to plug in, Christian Apologetics 101, and you can see where we're doing our next conference, April 2nd. Is our next one, where we'll actually have Jay Warner Wallace, Craig Hazen, and JP Moreland, who is an expert in the philosophy of mind. So if you want to learn more about that, everything I said that was correct comes from his work. Everything I said that was probably wrong and just, you know, totally ridiculous is probably my own stuff. So Moreland will be there at that next conference in Orange, Texas, April 2nd. You can go to texasapologetics.org to see the schedule and to register.
All right. Sounds good.
Go ahead, Ben.
So those are some really big names. That's really impressive, Eric. I definitely have to tune into that. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Hey, Jay's been on this show. Jay Warner.
Nice.
Yeah.
So my project is Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast, where we explore questions in the philosophy of religion from non-theist perspectives. And so several of our aims are to engage with the best in the philosophy of religion, in contemporary literature, debates, publications, things like that. And we are also trying to raise the level of discourse in conversations about the big questions in the philosophy of religion. We realize that these conversations can often be very toxic in internet environments. And so we want to give content to both sides of this debate in ways that are useful and constructive. Because at the end of the day, our aim is not to use arguments as weapons to defeat one another, but as tools to help resolve disagreements and hopefully make progress in the philosophy of religion. It's a really tall order, I know, but that's our aim.
Awesome. So it's just a way to get you closer to Jesus, right, Ben?
You can see
now you see my secret nefarious.
There you go.
Yeah. Yes. Excellent.
Awesome. Well, guys, again, we appreciate it so much. And like I said, part 2's got to come, man. It's got to come. All right.